Think back to the last side hustle you started. Maybe it was selling something online. Maybe it was freelancing. Maybe it was some kind of content or social media project you were convinced would eventually turn into real income. Do you still do it? If you're being honest with yourself, there's a strong chance the answer is no. And there's an even stronger chance you can't fully explain why you stopped, beyond some vague sense that it just kind of fizzled out. Here's a statistic that should genuinely concern anyone who's ever tried to build extra income on the side. Roughly 90% of side hustles are abandoned within 6 months of starting. Not because the ideas were bad, not because the market didn't exist. In the vast majority of cases, people quit for reasons that have almost nothing to do with the actual business or the actual money, and everything to do with a specific psychological pattern that almost nobody is taught to recognize, let alone defend against. My name is Colt, and today we're going deep into the actual psychology behind why side hustles die. Because once you understand the real mechanism at play, you'll start to notice it happening in real time, both in your own life and in basically everyone around you who's ever tried to build something on the side. If you've ever started something with genuine excitement and then watched that excitement completely evaporate within a few months, I need you to stick around for this one. Because understanding this pattern is the single biggest unlock for actually following through on anything. Subscribe and hit that like button if this resonates with you even a little. Let's start with the actual psychological mechanism, because it's more specific and more predictable than most people realize. The first phase of any side hustle is what psychologists sometimes call the motivation spike. When you first decide to start something new, your brain floods with dopamine, the neurotransmitter associated with anticipation and reward. This isn't really about the side hustle itself yet. It's about the idea of the side hustle, the imagined future version of yourself who's already successful at it. You picture the extra income, the sense of accomplishment, maybe even quitting your main job someday. This imagined future feels incredibly motivating, and that motivation is real. It's just based almost entirely on imagination rather than actual experience with the work itself. This explains why the first 1 to 2 weeks of almost any side hustle feel genuinely exciting. You're not actually dealing with the real difficulty of the work yet. You're still living in the anticipation phase, where your brain is rewarding you for the idea of future success, rather than for any actual progress you've made. This is an important distinction, because it means your early motivation was never really about the side hustle's reality. It was about its fantasy. Here's where things start to go wrong, and this is the actual mechanism behind that 90% failure rate. Somewhere around week 3 to week 6, depending on the specific person and specific project, the side hustle stops being a fantasy and starts being actual, unglamorous work. The reality of the task collides directly with the motivation that was generated entirely by imagination. And this collision is genuinely uncomfortable in a very specific, predictable way. Think about what this actually looks like in practice. Maybe you started a freelance writing side hustle, imagining yourself working from coffee shops, building a portfolio of clients, eventually replacing your full-time income. The reality 6 weeks in often looks like endless cold outreach messages that get ignored, clients who want major revisions for free, and per-hour earnings that feel almost insulting compared to your actual time invested. Maybe you started selling products online, imagining passive income flowing in while you sleep. The reality 6 weeks in often looks like customer service messages at all hours, inventory headaches, and profit margins that are far thinner than you initially calculated, after accounting for platform fees, shipping costs, and returns. This gap between the imagined version and the actual version isn't a sign that you picked the wrong side hustle. It happens with almost every single one, because the imagination phase is, by definition, frictionless. Your brain doesn't naturally simulate the boring parts, the rejection, the slow growth, the administrative tedium. It simulates the highlight reel. Reality, unfortunately, is mostly not highlight reel. Now here's the part that actually explains why people quit specifically around this time frame, rather than earlier or later. Psychologists call this the motivation valley, and it's an incredibly well-documented pattern across almost any new skill or pursuit, not just side hustles. Initial motivation, driven by imagination, is high. It then drops sharply as reality sets in, and the actual difficulty of the work becomes apparent. This is the valley. And critically, the valley happens before any meaningful results have had time to actually show up. You're past the easy, exciting beginning, but you haven't yet reached the point where consistent effort starts producing visible momentum. This is the exact window where the overwhelming majority of side hustles die. Not because they were destined to fail, but because the person quit during the single hardest, least rewarding phase of the entire process, right before things would have typically started to improve if they'd continued. Let me walk you through why this timing is so specifically dangerous, because understanding the actual mechanics here is incredibly useful. In almost any skill-based pursuit, results tend to follow a pattern that looks far more like a hockey stick than a straight line. Progress is slow, sometimes invisible, for a meaningful stretch of time, and then it begins compounding once you've built enough underlying skill, audience, reputation, or systems. The problem is that the motivation valley we just described tends to hit at almost exactly the same point where results are still flat, well before the compounding phase has had any chance to begin. So people experience maximum discomfort and minimum visible reward at the exact same moment, and their brain, quite reasonably from a short-term perspective, concludes that this clearly isn't working and it's time to quit. Here's the cruel irony embedded in this pattern. The people who do eventually succeed at side hustles aren't necessarily smarter or more talented than the 90% who quit. They're frequently just the specific subset of people who happen to push through the motivation valley without fully understanding why it felt so difficult. Sometimes through sheer stubbornness, sometimes through external pressure like financial necessity, and sometimes through pure luck of timing. The skill of surviving the valley is largely invisible from the outside, which is exactly why most success advice focuses entirely on strategy and tactics, while almost completely ignoring the psychological survival mechanism that actually determines who's still around long enough to benefit from those strategies in the first place. Let me give you a concrete example that illustrates this whole pattern clearly. Meet someone we'll call Jordan. Jordan starts a side hustle doing freelance graphic design, motivated by a genuine talent for design and a desire for extra income beyond their regular job. Week 1 feels incredible. Jordan builds a portfolio website, posts excitedly on social media about the new venture, and feels a genuine sense of identity shift. I'm becoming a freelance designer. Week 2 brings the first client inquiry, and Jordan is thrilled, landing a small paying project that confirms this whole thing might actually work. Week 4 is where things start to shift. The excitement of starting has worn off. Jordan is now doing actual unglamorous work, revising designs based on vague client feedback, dealing with a client who's slow to pay, and sending outreach messages to potential new clients that mostly get ignored or met with silence. The dopamine from the initial idea has completely faded. The actual reward, building a sustainable client base, hasn't materialized yet, because that genuinely takes more than 4 weeks in almost any freelance business. Jordan starts feeling discouraged, starts wondering if maybe they're just not cut out for this, starts comparing their slow progress to other designers online who appear to already be successful, never seeing the multiple months or years of unglamorous grinding those people went through before reaching that visible point. By week 6, Jordan has stopped actively pursuing new clients. The website hasn't been updated. The motivation that felt so powerful in week 1 is completely gone, replaced by a quiet sense that this probably just wasn't meant to work out. Jordan tells themselves a story about why it didn't work, usually something about not having enough time, or the market being too competitive, or just not having the right connections. Rarely does the story sound like, "I quit during the predictable motivation valley that happens to almost everyone," right before meaningful traction typically begins to build. That explanation doesn't feel as satisfying, even though it's frequently the most accurate one. So if this pattern is so common and so predictable, what actually separates the people who survive the valley from the 90% who don't? Because understanding the mechanism is only useful if it changes what you actually do differently. The first move is recognizing the valley before you're in it, rather than being blindsided by it. If you start any side hustle expecting the early excitement to fade significantly around the 3 to 6 week mark, that drop in motivation stops feeling like a signal that something's wrong and starts feeling like an expected, normal phase you're simply moving through. This single mental shift removes an enormous amount of the emotional weight that typically causes people to quit, because you're no longer interpreting normal difficulty as evidence of failure. The second move is separating your commitment from your daily motivation entirely. Motivation is an emotional state that naturally fluctuates, often for reasons that have nothing to do with whether your underlying strategy is working. Commitment is a decision you make in advance, independent of how you happen to feel on any specific day. Successful side hustlers typically aren't more motivated on a daily basis than everyone else. They've simply structured their commitment so it doesn't depend on daily motivation in the first place, often through specific systems, schedules, or accountability structures that keep them moving forward even during low motivation stretches. The third move is defining a genuinely meaningful trial period in advance. Before you start, rather than evaluating success or failure in real time based on how things feel in the moment. If you decide before starting that you're committing to a minimum of 90 days regardless of how it feels along the way, you remove the option to quit impulsively during the motivation valley, because you've already made that decision in advance, during a moment of clear thinking rather than mid-frustration. The fourth move is tracking actual inputs and effort rather than only tracking outputs and results during the early phase. Because results genuinely do lag behind effort in almost any new pursuit, focusing exclusively on results during the early months will almost always feel discouraging, regardless of whether you're actually on a reasonable trajectory. Tracking consistent inputs. Did I send outreach messages today? Did I publish content this week? Did I show up and do the actual work? Gives you a more honest and more encouraging measure of whether you're actually doing what's required, separate from whether the results have caught up yet. The fifth move, and this one matters more than people expect, is deliberately seeking out realistic timelines from people who've actually succeeded at similar pursuits, rather than only seeing their highlight reel after they've already made it. Almost everyone who eventually succeeds at a side hustle went through a genuinely difficult, unglamorous middle period that simply isn't visible from the outside. Actively seeking out that information, through honest conversations, behind-the-scenes content, or simply asking directly, recalibrates your expectations toward reality rather than toward the curated success stories that dominate social media and create a completely distorted sense of how quickly things are supposed to work. Here's the deeper insight underneath all of this. The actual determining factor in whether a side hustle succeeds usually isn't the specific idea, the market opportunity, or even raw talent. It's whether the person attempting it understood, in advance, that there would be a predictable period of low motivation and minimal visible results, and whether they had a system in place to keep moving forward through that period, regardless of how unmotivated they happen to feel on any individual day. 90% of people quit during that exact window, mistaking a universal psychological pattern for a personal sign of failure. The 10% who continue aren't necessarily smarter, more talented, or even more disciplined in some abstract sense. They simply understood, or stumbled into understanding, that the valley is normal, temporary, and survivable, and they built systems that didn't depend on feeling motivated every single day to keep moving forward anyway. If you're currently in the middle of your own motivation valley with something you started, I want you to actually consider that what you're feeling right now might not be a sign to quit. It might just be the completely predictable, completely normal phase that almost everyone experiences right before things genuinely start to improve, if you simply continue showing up. If this gave you a clearer way to think about following through on things, subscribe, because we break down exactly this kind of thing every single week. And if you know someone who's currently in the middle of quitting on something they started with real excitement, send them this video before they make that decision permanent.